Hi, everybody. My name is Curtis Wagner. I'm a first year here at NIT Sloan, and I'm the student lead for a data-driven storytelling panel. I'm honored and excited to introduce our guests today. First up, we have Chris Collinsworth, CEO of Pro Football Focus and NBC Sportscaster. We also have Nate Silver, who is the founder and managing editor of 538. We also have Bill Barnwell. He is a writer for ESPN.com. And finally, we got Brian Kenny, who's a host at MLB Network. The panel will be moderated by Chad Millman, editorial director of ESPN's digital content. The panel will last 45 minutes. We'll have 15 minutes of moderated Q&A at the end. So we encourage you to interact with us via Twitter and ask questions using the hashtag #DataTales. The questions with the most mentions will be asked on stage. So with that, take it away, guys.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone, for coming this afternoon. The first question I have is going to be for each of you. I want each of you to answer because it's so core to what you do. But how do you guys incorporate analytics into your storytelling? Chris, since you're at the end, we'll start with you.
It all starts with that. I mean, I'm sitting here looking out at maybe a few hundred people I'd like to hire right now, because the very essence of what we do starts with some data point. Starts with something that has been delivered to us that we then take and extract something from that. Pro Football Focus gave me something on James Harrison once about what an incredible second half of the year he had, that he was only playing about 30% of the snaps in the first half of the season, and about 70% of the snaps in the second half had become their best player. Well, that bit of data led me to Mike Tomlin, who said, yeah, we're not stupid. We didn't need him in the early part of the year. We want him ready for the playoffs. We want to win the Super Bowl. Okay, that's a bit of a story. So then I go to James Harrison, and I said, well, tell me how you're the leading sacker on this team at age 38, right? And he said, because when I come around the corner, I try and break that guy's arm. And I said, what? He goes, yeah, you want me to show you? And I went, no. And he said, yeah, stand up, stand up. So I'm standing, and he's not smiling, he's not doing anything. I'm a storyteller, right? So I'm supposed to be, I'm like, okay. And he comes up and I still don't know what he did. And I was like, put my hand on his chest, and he went, and he, did one of those things, whatever. And he goes, I don't beat them with speed, I break their arm. So we tell that story on the air, right? So that's kind of how it goes. And then the last one, I was immediately trying to get him to let go of my arm. And I said, just tell me anything about you personally, man. So he finally let show my arm. And I said, what do you like to do? And he said, I like to watch cartoons. I was like, what? You like to watch cartoons? He goes, yeah, I got a couple kids. He goes, when I finish working out, So out of the one bit of data that said he was 30% early in the year, 70% late in the year, you begin to put the pieces together, and pretty soon you have this story that sort of unfolds over a half a quarter in the game, because nobody wants to just hear the data. To me, it's always about, can we take the helmet off the guy? Can we make him human? I had a lady one time when I was playing with the Bengals who came up to me after the game. I'm in a bar, of course. And so she came up and she goes, Chris. She goes, I was at the game today. I go, oh, that's great. She goes, no, you don't understand. I was in the end zone, like right in the first row. And when you guys came down the field and you were about to score a touchdown, like I could look and see like inside the helmets, and you guys, you looked almost human. I was like, no kidding. Son of a gun, is that right? But I think that's what we all are. I think we're a little bit of the Fox robot, that there's this big monster out there, and our jobs, I think collectively, is to take the helmets off, take the hat off, to let somebody connect with that person on a personal level, because I can't think of James Harrison anymore without thinking about him breaking my arm and sitting there with his kids watching cartoons. And all of it the beginning of the discussion came from a data point that then you extrapolate out into a story.
So, Brian, I want to go to you for a second, because Chris is going to do this in the context of a game broadcast, 15, 20 seconds between plays, run it over the course of a quarter. How are you doing it from your perspective?
Well, it's interesting, even as I was thinking about this, I think, to me, I see it differently in that the world of the numbers is a world unto itself. And I'm fortunate enough to have bridged this, the eras, actually, where back in the day, we all talked those numbers. 1,000 yards of receiving was the benchmark. 101 RBIs was better than 95. If you hit 340, it was better than 327. And then we learned that, no, that's not necessarily the case. From the hidden game of baseball on, I learned that everything is in the world of context. Everything is something to be mined, and that you get all these data points, whatever you call it, the metrics, the stats, and then from there, you try to find out what it actually means. And that's a world unto itself. It's vastly different. So, in terms of, to answer your question, actually, to go into the show, which I'll try to do now and then, on the show, what we try to do is I try to find the best questions, because that's what it's about. That's where it's at, not the numbers. Obviously, the numbers will be part of the evidence that you'll find to try to find the truth, but everything starts with just the questions. Why are they winning? What are they doing? How good is this player? What's apparent? What's hidden? And all of that. So there's an entire world just based within the numbers, and we've only, I believe, had that revealed to us over the last generation, over the last 30 years. Before that, Bill Terry hit 401 in 1930, and that was that. Ty Cobb was the greatest hitter ever because he had a 366 or 367 batting average, and that was that. Now we've learned all sorts of different things within that, the run scoring environment, and you can go on and on and on. So that's the fascinating part to me, is that it's never over. It's always about getting the numbers and figuring out, what do those numbers represent? What does it mean?
Bill and Nate, you guys do it in an entirely different way because you're focused on telling that story in sort of subject and verb form. And you guys have done it almost capturing the zeitgeist of the generation that's here and understanding that these are people who are looking at games through an entirely different prism. So when you're sitting down to think about your column on Monday, how are you trying to manage these different factors?
I feel like it's a couple of things. For one, it's an issue of credibility, right? Like someone like Chris played the game, has a level of knowledge, like you've forgotten more about the game than I'm ever going to know. So realistically, I can't expect to compete on that. And for me, it's always been like, well, why would anybody listen to me if I didn't have as much evidence as possible behind whatever I was going to say? So I think it sort of evolves from that, where it's like, just sort of the same thing that Brian's saying, where it's like, well, let's start with the question. It's not just, why did this team win? That can be a question, but it's more just, why is this team winning the way they're winning? What would interest me as a fan, as someone who watched the games on Sunday? What would I want to read about Monday morning? So I think you sort of take those questions, those starting points, and then that leads you to data, and then that data, eventually creates part of the story. If I find nothing interesting, then it's, maybe this is just randomness, and I don't know any better. And if there's something that stands out, then it's, actually this explanation that makes sense in my head does make sense with the data, and then that naturally evolves into a story that seems to make sense.
Nate, for you, was it data led you to wanting to tell these stories in a certain way, or you were interested in telling stories and you felt the best avenue to get to them was data?
I've always had a little bit of both, right? Where when I was in high school, I was on the debate team. You're kind of using evidence to make arguments. So, to me, they're not necessarily in conflict, but a couple of things that these guys have said are important, right? Number one, the data, if you're covering the NFL, writing a column about the NFL, it's a column about football. It's not a column about data, and I think people miss that sometimes. If you want to write a column about methodology, that can be useful to this audience, right? Then write a column about methodology, right? And don't make it a column about football. It's just an example, but we look at the numbers because we are interested in sports, we're interested in politics, and we want a high burden of proof. We want evidence for our conclusions. And so in that sense, part of what we stand on the side of is having more rigor, where you have to prove as much as you can in this context where we're writing articles quickly off the news, so it's hard, right? Or describing a game in real time. I mean, that's a hard thing to do, right? Easy in academic setting to go and take months to write a paper, right? But when you have to say something that's topical and smart and relevant in 20 seconds, or in a column that turns around in 3 hours, then that's challenging, right? But it's demanding kind of more rigor and being curious about the world, and but statistics aren't just numbers, right? It's also a process by which we understand the world, right? And evaluate which hypotheses are true, how do we know what's real and what's fake, and so that's, I think, philosophically where it kind of goes.
Even when we're in the Bill James room, right? Yeah. This is the Bill James room. What Bill James was so instructive years ago in saying that when he was going to answer some baseball questions, he didn't go to statistics. He said he found that everybody within the game of baseball was already speaking the language of statistics. So he just matched that. We were already doing that, just with batting average, home runs, and RBIs, and these measurements that we just never questioned. So I think that is the starting point.
It's been really interesting that football and hockey and basketball were behind baseball. But to some extent, it makes some intuitive sense too. Because you have a pitcher, you have a batter, and generally one fielder involved in making the play. So statistically, and the data acquisition was pretty objective. That was a ball, that was a strike, that was a hit, that was an error, that was what, and I think a lot of people were drawn to that. That I can follow this and sort of keep score at home, and I know I was as a kid. I thought that was really cool stuff. Mm-hmm. Now when you get into other sports, it's much less sort of objective and a little bit more subjective. At Pro Football Focus, we get all the time. We just got back from the Combine, which, by the way, is now every NFL team has 5 people between ages 25 and 35, male and female, that have never played football, that are making huge decisions about how game plans are being put together. I was absolutely blown away by what I saw. But those kinds of decisions, and the pushback we always get is, oh, how can you know? How can you know, you don't know what the play call is, you don't know what the coverage is, I go, listen, I would trust my mother's opinion if she watched the left tackle on every single play for his entire career and put the numbers of what that guy was doing and what he did. You have to have the data behind it to build the systems, to make the decisions, to make the play calls, to win the games. But it all starts with the data. And that's what the people in this room, I think, need to understand, is that while baseball was first there, I read Moneyball and I was Bill James, I love all that stuff, right? But it's taken football and some of these other sports a long time to catch up. Politics was there long ago, right? They did. But now, for the first time, we're seeing a generation of people that are the age of some of the young people in here that can have a dramatic impact on professional sports, collegiate sports, and it's not going to get less. It's going to get bigger and bigger, because now the coaches aren't my age anymore. They are 31 years old. They are 35 years old. And they're used to manipulating data. They're not afraid of numbers. They're not afraid of iPads and computers and spreadsheets. And so you're going to see the game move more and more that way. And from my standpoint, I think it's really exciting.
Brian, you wrote a book, Ahead of the Curve, that focuses on a lot of these concepts. When did it click for you? When did you realize, wow, I can use these kind of tools for great storytelling?
It was gradual, as I wrote in the book, and it started, I remember reading Hidden Game of Baseball, which came out in 1984, and I got it in a piece of Total Baseball. I was just buying a baseball encyclopedia, and that was Pete Palmer and John Thorne. They had a baseball encyclopedia. I got it in 1990, 1991, and there was a little chapter on sabermetrics that was in there, but it didn't hit me right away. Again, we're resistant to change constantly, and even though I had my Hall of Fame charts constantly, and I was always trying to see who belongs in the Hall of Fame, who doesn't. I had Hall of Fame nights on my talk show in the 1980s, and yet I still saw that Pro Plus. It was Pro Plus, which was OPS Plus now, and it was total player rating, which was the early thing of WAR. It wasn't wins above replacement back then, but I was still resistant to it, but somewhere I was listening, and then it took many years before I started to realize, okay, because I was doing highlights every night, and by the time I got to ESPN, I'm doing more highlights. By the time I get to baseball tonight, I'm doing 2 hours of baseball a night. And every time you say, Bobby Abreu, with a double, he drives in a run, that leaves a little space where you have to say something. You're just doing a highlight. And I used to say, hey, Bobby Abreu is hitting 344. Now I would say, Bobby Abreu is second in the National League in on base. Bobby Abreu is third in slugging, because I thought that was more important for the viewer to know. That put the context of his value in instant perspective. And I think for me, even just listening to what Chris is saying, when you talk about this generation I think takes it for granted now that everything is data-based and evidence-based. We come from the horseshit generation, where, where the storytelling was just there. And all due respect, things would be told to us by someone who played the game, which maybe it was true, maybe it was not true. Maybe it just worked for that guy because he could break everybody's arm. We don't know. But now, everybody takes that for granted. Now, I never take it for granted, that because from the previous generation, you just hear, everything was anecdotal storytelling. Everything was sort of that, and occasionally you'd get something that was evidence-based. Now the scrutiny and the bar, the standard is just so much higher, where I will listen to Chris if Chris's methods are sound, if his information is good, and probably a lot of people here don't even know you were an excellent wide receiver, right? At a certain point, only your information is going to carry you through.
But that's why, to get back to your original question, if you start with a data point, and you start with something that you can trust, a number, some data point, and then you extrapolate from there, it gives some feeling of confidence to someone like you that, hey, he's just not saying this because he's full of crap, right? He's saying this because he's done some research. He's done some work to back that up.
But it also feels a little bit like there is something generational about wanting to have something solid to hold on to when you are having a conversation. What are you thinking about when you're writing that piece that someone's going to be able to grab this?
Well, I think we're at a different point in terms of the ability to gauge the effectiveness of the people who are talking as experts, right? Like, 20 years ago, if your local newspaper columnist, 30 years ago maybe, your local columnist said, hey, the Braves are going to stink this year, and the Braves won the pennant, how many people are saving the newspaper from April, and they're going to see this newspaperman and be like, yeah, you said they were going to stink, it showed you. And like now, that's a column on the internet, and you can tweet at the person who you are, the person who wrote that column, and say, hey, here's the link to your column that said they were going to stink, so what happened? Like, you have a significant level of accountability that might not have been there 30 years ago. And I think it's also the reality of, there's more qualified people for fewer jobs at this point. So if you're really bad at your job, it's harder to hold on to it for 30 years than it would have been 30 years ago. So I think there's you kind of have to, you can't pretend that you didn't say things. You can't pretend that the stuff that you were talking about is relevant at this point. You have to really sort of back up what you're saying. And if you want to be good at that, you have to have evidence behind it. No one's gut is that smart.
So, Nate, you're sort of the master of finding the signal in the noise. And so how often are you running any kind of data you're using from a sports perspective through any kind of testing? And I know in the last panel with Mark, you talked a little bit about back testing and stuff, but what kind of application do you use back testing for sports columns?
I mean, people start by, basically people don't realize that statistics are kind of a form of history in a sense, right? And a model is a way of describing history, and how well that model will apply in the future is an open question. I started with baseball, where you have very large data sets, very high quality data, where the hypotheses are fairly simple. Does on-base percentage or batting average predict winning better? That's a pretty simple question. That's kind of a little bit idiot-proof, right? And that's not always true. So I worry a little bit that we're in a realm now where, because it is generational, right? You can fight these battles against the establishment, and you're like, man, it's so frustrating, right? Because I feel like we're really on the right side of history here, and you won't push very far, but then you'll see, the audience for 538, and I'm sure for Bill's column, is a pretty young audience, because people who grew up in this era where it's a part of the conversation, there's not the natural aversion to it, and you have to bring some of it, right? But I do worry we're maybe for the first time in history at a point where people are going too far, right? I think it's important to talk to people who played the game and important to talk to people who are involved in the game about what their experience is like. Just because you can't measure something doesn't mean it's unimportant. It also doesn't mean it's important, right? But having awareness of the limitations of what your models might be, and that adds another dimension too, right? If you are trying to say, first of all, trying to tell a story, and you want to reach a wide audience for it, but at the same time want to describe fairly complex methodological and philosophical limitations to what you're doing, I mean, that takes a lot of work. And so, one thing we've learned is that you do need good editing. You do need to be thoughtful about what you say. You have to kind of label clearly and make a clear promise to the reader where, I've joked sometimes, like, I wish we could have, like, different fonts, where when we're just, like, spitballing something, we write it in Comic Sans, right, or disappearing ink. And when we're more serious, it's like Times New Roman or something, right? And when you're doing a broadcast or like a podcast is kind of an analogy to it, or on a panel, you can like modulate your tone and your intonation, so you kind of know, hey, I'm having a conversation with you over a beer, here are things running through my head, don't take it too seriously. In a column, like you say, I mean, we've experienced this obviously too, where everything that you write is written down and the accountability is terrific in some ways, but also a little bit frightening in another way, where like people will dig into obscure footnotes, literally, right? And be like, you wrote this in 2004, and you were totally wrong, and that's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
I think along those lines, you have to make a decision. How deep am I going to have to couch this?
Yeah.
Like when you write something, this is my bold proclamation. Given that, this also. Given that, this might happen. Given that, we're not so sure. Given that, it's something you have to write, but that makes for a crappy column a lot of the times. Like, no, just say it and stand by it, or are you going to couch it? Because there's always that context.
Yeah.
And right, going from a column to writing a book, I was like, okay, if I don't say this, now I'm going to hear this. I know, because as you're writing it, the first thing I'm going to hear is, yeah, but what about this? Okay, I could write that, but that's going to take 3 more paragraphs to write. And you have to make those choices.
Yeah, and I think the classic example of what Nate was talking about, and Brian, you're referring to as well, is catcher framing, right? Where if you read those old baseball prospectuses, even before Nate got there, someone like Brad Ausmus is just like, this dude sucks, he can't hit, why is he in the game? And now, like, you look back and Brad Ausmus was a super valuable player because we know how to quantify catcher framing to some extent now. And that's, it totally changed what we would have thought 15 years ago. And I think that can be a positive in a way, because you think, okay, well, there's been columns on BP in the past. I think Gary Huckabee wrote one that was like, well, we're pretty much done with baseball research. It's almost over. And no, there's still so many things to look at and so many things to talk about that as much as it's difficult to look at data now and how much we've done in the past 15 years, there's still so much more to get to and so much more to test and question. And I think having those instincts are a really positive thing.
And a lot of things that we thought that were blasted have now circled back to very playerish things like that, like something catcher framing that I have conversations with former major league catchers that Dave Valley, who I work with at MLB Network, will say, oh, you're always taught to be quiet back there. Yeah. Don't stab at the ball. Be quiet, be gentle, bring it in, collect it, receive it. And so a lot of these things we're getting back to now, and believe me, I work with all these Major League Baseball players, a lot of things that were very 1980s-ish that I'd kind of snicker at, admittedly. Now you'll get to the point, it's like, okay, I see that point, now we perhaps can measure that, now we can see that, and it turns out the players weren't imagining it. There was real value in the craft of what they were doing at the time.
One of the things you guys were talking about, though, is have we reached some kind of saturation point yet, right? Is there too much? And I'm going to make the argument the other way. I'm going to say there's not enough. I have 4 kids. They're all in their 20s now. And they're as ADD as I am, right? So they can't just watch TV, or they can't just play a video game. They've got, their phone on this thing, and they've got their headphones on, and they've got their iPad over here, and they're kicking the cat with the other thing, and they want action. They want action. And I'm not so sure. It's one of the things that we're dealing with our company now is, second screen opportunities. Or is there the ability to take this data? Not everybody's going to want to hear it. It's sort of like, can you remember the first time that Fox put the scoreboard in the upper right-hand corner or whatever? Man, all hell broke loose. They're completely destroying the experience. And now you turn on some cable news channel, and there's 17 lines running underneath the thing. ESPN, you've got the news inside the news, and and I think that even at NBC, we could do a better job of that we could have something on their iPad or whatever that okay, let's get some data, let's get some statistics, let's get some fantasy results, because they can consume it. This is an unbelievable generation. They can consume all this stuff at the same time, and every time I watch it, I go, it's like a sporting event I go to. I was like, that's awesome, man. How do you do that? You know, it's unbelievable.
So you guys have mentioned scrutiny, you've mentioned context. How do you, Chris, especially sort of for a football audience where the data is sort of still being parsed and understood, deliver that in a way that you can surround, like a spoonful of medicine, you know, surrounded by the sugar kind of thing? Do you feel like you have to do that?
Yeah, let me give you the other side of the coin now, okay? The other side is that about 70% of men are going to watch football. Whatever it's going to be. I don't know what baseball, but that's about the number. And about when I first started playing football and broadcasting, it was about 35%, I'm making up these numbers, but it's something like that, of women would participate in some way. Now that number has grown to 50%, and the men are still at 70%. So we spend a lot of time, we don't want to oversaturate them with numbers and data and football talk and, you know, all that. We want to tell stories, to get all the way back to our thing. We want to take the helmet off of them. We want grandma to be every bit as comfortable as the guy that's got the $1,000 bet on the game in what they're consuming. So now there is a real effort to give great balance across the board. So you pull out your best data, you tell your best stories, you take the helmet off of this guy, you try to make the tent as big and inclusive as you possibly can. Now there are certain spots where, you know, if you're on the baseball network, man, those people are watching that. They want it all, right? They want all the numbers. But on Sunday Night Football, I mean, we're competing against whatever is on these days, the vampire. No, what's the show? You guys know what's the show? It's the
Game of Thrones.
Huh? Walking Dead. So that's who we're competing against, right? Walking Dead, and they're coming out. So how do you do that? You got to try and be inclusive with it.
Well, it brings up the question of, what is the future of broadcasting? We've given that a lot of thought. We do we used to call it a sabermetric broadcast. And Rob and I did the first one with us, and we had Kevin Millar on that too. And John Smoltz did it last year with, we had Jonah Carey on. And it was an avalanche of analysis. Now, is that good or does that stink? I don't know. It was exhausting, but to call a game trying to apply all these things instantaneously, maybe it's a bit much, or maybe that's what the future will want. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I think, you know, we're sort of seeing a broader thing with pop culture in general, where I think people, you know, the wide variety of options available to you, regardless of what you're interested in, you can sort of be more specific, right? Like, you don't have to watch, not to say anything about NBC, which is a wonderful network, but you don't have to watch the major 4 broadcast networks. Those ratings on the whole are down, and people are watching more distinct programming, whether it's on a specific network, whether it's something on the internet. You know, you can sort of find your niche and hit that harder than you could have 30 years ago. There's just more content available. So I think it's sort of a thing where I think we're all figuring out at this point, you know, how are those broadcasts changing? Like you said, when ESPN, for example, had the national championship game, they had 6 different channels covering the national championship game. And one of them was the coaches channel, which I watch because I'm a nerd. And one of them was a more general broadcast, one of which was, you know, I think the All-22, the overhead angle. You know, there are all these different ways to watch the game. And so I think, you know, sort of in general, for most people, regardless of their gender or where they're interested in, you know, one broadcast is going to make sense. They're going to want just this general traditional broadcast, but I think you may be interested in a different sort of angle of the game, regardless of who you are. I think there's more of a, you know, there's more of a way to focus on a particular element of the game that is interesting to a subset of people, and I think the technology is going to make that more palatable and more available to different people.
It's interesting. I thought the coaches broadcast was great. Remember a few years ago watching it, and after a while I was like, you know what? I want to hear Brent and Herbie. Yeah. I want to hear the play-by-play guy, and I want to hear the color guy. It's the Muzak of the game, and I missed it. You know, and so I eventually went back to, I want standard, down and distance, call it, react to it, let it breathe a little bit, and play. Mm-hmm. So I see real value in just a traditional, you know, broadcast as well.
have you guys noticed the columns that you write or the information that you share transitioning from being used for utility purposes? I want to be a better gambler. I want to be better at fantasy football. I want to be better at fantasy baseball, to the transition of it being accepted by a much broader and wider audience? Nate, I'll start with you on that one.
I mean, I know that 538's audience has grown a lot, right? And is, you know, for election stuff, NCAA tournament stuff is quite large, right? So there is a big audience out there. We also see the flip side of sometimes our stuff is used for political purposes, right? And so if you kind of come up as a blogger, as Bill and I did in different ways, right? You kind of go from knowing your audience really super well to knowing your audience less well, and that's a challenge because anything is catered to the audience. You know, I think the best columns and the best articles on the web, and you know, maybe the best shows is like when you have kind of an onion peel type of thing where you have some exterior layer that might be a little bit superficial, but still resonates and is like broadly true, right? And then you want to go a second layer deep, a third layer deep for people who are more hardcore about it, right? Maybe they see footnotes and they see charts and graphics. They can download some data. That is one advantage of technology now, is that you can experience the same game in different ways, right? I'm with Brian, where like, you know, if I go to a Rangers game or something, right? I'm there drinking beer and looking up a few things on my phone, right? But I'm there for the experience mostly, and kind of it's more when you get back away from the game and you start thinking about things, and you know. But we know a ton of people use 538 as a second screen experience during the Super Bowl, during presidential debates, during the NCAA tournament, and so forth. Because you know, kids these days, right, really are doing 3 or 4 things at once, and they get very immersed in the moment, and so kind of sitting back and being totally passive as a viewer, you know, might seem a little bit passé, but you can also have the broadcast be one part of your experience and you're doing 3 other things at the same time.
Chris, what metrics do you think would help people understand football better that they don't really know about right now or aren't paying attention to?
Interesting. I think people don't have a great understanding of line play and don't have a great understanding of defensive play in general, especially the secondary crime. I mean, it's not even on television. You can't even see it half the time, you know? And so it's interesting that the data, some of the data from Pro Football Focus that I use the most are offensive line stuff. Because who has that, right? Who can go back 10 games and evaluate the left guard versus the defensive tackle on the other side? Who's the better matchup? And all of a sudden, the game isn't just about the quarterback and the wide receiver and the running back. There's something else to watch. Al Michaels watches the ball during our broadcast. I don't. I never watch the ball. Sometimes the ball runs into where I'm watching, you know, but you can, and John Madden, I love John Madden, and I asked him one time, how you call the game? And he said, you call it inside out. I was like, what? He said, you call it inside out. He said, if you watch the offensive line, they'll tell you where the ball is going. And you'll end up, you may be watching the guard, but if he's pulling out in front of him, I guarantee the tailback's coming somewhere right behind him, and you'll be able to see it. And so, you know, sometimes I hear announcers will call a game and they'll, you know, the play-by-play guy go, oh, it's a sweep off to the right. He makes a cut, he makes a missed tackle, and he's out of bounds at the 20. And then the color analyst goes, hey, did you see him make him miss the cut? And he went out of bounds on the 20. I'm like, well, yeah, the other guy just told me that. I did see that. So what I'm trying to do is watch what you're not, because you're going to watch the ball. And, you know, as a fan, you're going to watch the ball. So now add to that somehow. Give me something else that I didn't see. And if I can do that, and I think where a lot of that comes is in the secondary and the offensive and defensive line.
When did that change for you?
Honestly, when I met Neil Hornsby, wherever he is, and all this, once you get the treasure trove of data, you know, I mean, when I first started doing this, I would go to the stadium, and if I had one newspaper article from the San Diego, what's the San Diego Tribune?
Union Tribune.
Union Tribune. So if I had one article about San Diego, it was like gold, right? I had insights into that team and, you know, pre-internet and all that kind of stuff. Or maybe it was. I don't know. I didn't have the internet at the time. and so, but now, there's no way I could watch every bit of film, read every article, watch every show, see every breakdown. And so now what I do is I effectively, with our company, I start with all the analytics. And I know we've got 25 NFL teams, hopefully 30 by the time this season starts, where that is the beginning of the process. All the data, all the analytics, that all comes from people that have never coached, that have never played, that have grinded out these numbers. We've got 300 people that work for our company now, and they grind out all that stuff, and that is my Monday. That is what I do all day Monday, so that when I turn on the film on Tuesday, I have some basis of understanding of who that guy is, who their best players are, where their weakness is. Now, sometimes I may disagree with it, but not very often. And I think that's the big difference. I think coaches are doing the same thing. Where it used to be on Monday, everybody just turned on the film and watched 3 games, and that was sort of how they did their research. And I don't think anybody's doing that now.
Brian, same question for you, but what do you think? And Bill just said, someone wrote an article, you know, sabermetrics is over in baseball, or that revolution is over in baseball. But what do you think people aren't seeing? What metrics aren't they paying attention to that would help them better appreciate what's happening in baseball?
Well, it's tough with the avalanche of data now. I've for the first time thought the more we know, the less we know. You know, we've gotten to a point now. We do a thing in the off season called Top 10 right now, when we rank every position, the top 10 players. And I used to be very resolute about it. And I think that was because the schism was still there between those who studied and those who didn't. Now that everybody is studying, and now that there's a lot more measurement data, the StatCast data and all of that, there are so many more things to look at, so many more layers to keep digging into. That will Andrew McCutchen come back? I don't know. You know, again, you can look at so many different things that it's bewildering. I mean, and things change. You know, FIP used to be kind of the new thing, and now with the incredible rise of strikeouts, we're in kind of a post-FIP era. And just a quick example, I wrote a column on this. It used to be when a guy had 10 strikeouts and 1 walk, he pitched a great game. Now we see guys with 10 strikeouts, 1 walk, he gave up 7 runs. Was that a good game? No, but it used to be, but it's not anymore. So things are always changing. There's always more context. And I would bring it back to, it's always about the questions. What's the question? What's fascinating to know about this team? Why are the Cubs so good? How did they get where they're at? And then you can mine it deeper and deeper as to why is Jake Arrieta struggling? But there are so many more answers and possible answers, I guess, that it's overwhelming. And you can get to a point where, hey, the world is largely unknowable, and it's very difficult to project these things. And maybe you get back to the guy's work ethic and his makeup. You know, maybe it comes back to that. Well, what was wrong with Andrew McCutchen last year? What was happening in his life? It's probably more important than his exit velocity. But you want all that information. And in the old days, you know, again, we used to be pretty hard on the mainstreamists because they weren't even getting that information. Once you have an unbelievable amount of data and the measurement data, all the StatCast stuff and win probability and run expectancy and what you're doing in the clutch situations on top of the context neutral situations. You have all of that. Well, now you have to go to something else, and those things are more of the human things. So I think that's where it's at. There's always going to be something new, but it's always going to start from what question are you trying to answer?
Did you want to say something?
No, good.
Oh, I mean, I want you to say something, the rest of the panel, but I can ask
everyone else is saying smart things. So I'm going to be like, yeah, same.
Well, what do you do? What do you do when someone is coming after you because you've been wrong?
Block them on Twitter.
Right, block them on Twitter. But and you have the information that sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. How do you manage that when you're telling a story the next time you want to use that information?
Well, I think it's about, there's a couple things in play here. Number one is that no one's going to be perfect or close to it. And I think unfairly, especially at the beginning of sort of the quote-unquote sabermetric era, the baseline for sabermetrics was unfair. It was not just to be better than what had existed previously, it was to be perfect. So, when the Red Sox were doing a bullpen by committee, it was, oh, well, every sabermetric tenant is ruined because, Scott Williamson isn't that good of a reliever. No, that's not fair, that's not realistic. So I think, number one, it's about, am I adding to the conversation? Is what I'm doing adding value to the conversation? Because I'm going to get stuff wrong. It's the reality of what happens, no matter what I'm doing. And then on top of that, it's, well, why was the thing I did wrong? Was it that I didn't watch enough tape? Was it that the numbers I were using were inaccurate? Was it a matter of semantics? Was it is it something where I misinterpreted it? Or was it just randomness? Was it, the Falcons recovered 5 fumbles out of the 5 that were on the floor in the first 2 games of the playoffs, and because of that, they were in much better shape than they would have been otherwise. It's all about why you're wrong, as opposed to just being wrong, because you're inevitably going to be wrong. It happens.
Nate, do you see this kind of information being misused in storytelling?
I mean, I think it's kind of pertinent to the question you asked Bill, too, right? People have trouble wrapping their heads around the fact that numbers can be used to convey uncertainty, as well as what the central tendency might be, right? So we had obviously a very interesting example where our forecast had Trump on election day with a 30% chance roughly of winning. The betting markets had him with a 15% chance. He had some models had him at literally 1%, right? And so when Trump wins, are you right or are you wrong, right? And the way I think of it in a competitive landscape, you're having arguments with people, and so our argument was that, no, I mean, this election's competitive, don't take things for granted, right? Still, I guess you'd rather have the 70% chance come through, I don't know. And so, people forget, though, that sabermetrics aren't perfect. In fact, they're a long way from perfect. One of the lessons of the empirical method is kind of like you said, Brian, right? We know less than we think, right? And because we know less than we think is why we have to be evidence-driven and rigorous, because our guts aren't always good for the types of problems that are vexing problems that are important in society, or the things that make decisions about player acquisition, whatever else, right? And so you have to step back and say, I'm kind of a dumbass, and that's why I want to be more transparent in my process, why I want to be more rigorous. By the way, why you do have to be immersed in the subject you're covering, right? You have to be a football fan and really love football, whether you're an ex-player or a broadcaster or someone using data. You have to love the field that you're in and be immersed in it, because I found that the times when I really get things wrong, not a low probability comes through that you measure in a decent way, right? But it's through kind of sloppy work, right? It's when you are under pressure to say something quickly, when you haven't had times to analyze the situation. You're still going to be wrong lots of the time, even when you are immersed in a problem, but you tend to fail better, right? You can show people, here's why I'm wrong, but here's why I thought that, and I hope it's a reasonable argument that you saw I was making before. If you rush through things, though, and do kind of quick twitch reaction, then you can be really, really profoundly kind of existentially wrong.
But it's unbelievable that we're talking about predictive analytics here at this point. No matter who you are, you're not getting all those right.
No.
I love the guys. I was at the Super Bowl this year, and I love the guys that were walking around the game after the game in the stadium going, I knew the Patriots are going to cover the spread. It's like, get the hell out of here. You're down 28-3. You didn't know anything. But there's this idea that you can foresee and foretell what's going to happen in a game. And then all of a sudden the game breaks out. Anybody want to try and tell me they knew what Game 7 of the World Series was going to be like? Give me a break. I mean, sometimes there are just legendary things that happen, and there's human beings playing the game, and there is raw emotion. So there are numbers that can get you close to it, and you can have an idea. But the greatness of sports is that nobody knows what the end of that movie is. Nobody. You can guess, but just think of the championship games that were played this year. Come back down 3-1 in the NBA. The World Series, one of the great World Series. The Super Bowl, one of the great Super Bowls. The election. Absolute insanity broke loose, right? You can think that you know, you don't know.
And it's funny, the trick is not to find things that are difficult to measure. Like people will always hear that. It's like, oh, Brian Kenny, there's no metric for that. And I'm like, well, the trick is not to find things that are difficult to figure out. Everything is difficult to figure out. The trick is to to find some truth to it, or some realistic, probabilistic sense of it. Again, the world is a Bill James thing, is that the world is largely unknowable and you cannot figure it out. So you can get a small bit of it and try to make some sense out of the chaos, and that's the best you can do.
How much higher are the stakes for whatever story you're telling, whether it's in the middle of a broadcast or a column you're writing, when you are basing any of your argument on numbers versus the way it was many, many years ago, where you're someone with an opinion?
More so, I would say a little bit more so, but I think it's more that it depends on the person, right? Where I feel like for me, like I said earlier, like I have to have evidence. So the stakes are I have to get the evidence right at the very least. Now, I can be wrong about my opinion. I will be wrong about my opinion a fair amount. That's fine. But, on those rare times where I do just have a gut feeling, I've really got to be sure about it because I have less to stand on than any of you guys. So I feel like, evidence makes it easier and harder in different ways. It's easier in that I don't have to rely on my gut as much, but it is harder from the sense of just, I need to have that stuff in there more frequently. I can't use my gut the way that other people can.
Well, probably like in the 1954 World Series, they were wondering how Dusty Rhodes was suddenly a hot hitter. And then you can go to the first level and say, well, in any given week, if you play fantasy baseball, you know this, in any given week, any major league player can hit like Lou Gehrig. But then you go to another level, and now maybe we know that certain hitters hit good pitching better. Hunter Pence hits good pitching better. Maybe he recognizes fastballs better. Maybe he handles the spin rate and the velocity better, or the action on a pitch. So just when you think you know something, no, there's another level to it. Just when you think, oh, there isn't clutch. Yeah, but there is the ability to hit good pitching. And the good pitching you're going to see in the World Series, that will come through as a guy being clutch. He has better plate coverage and that sort of thing. And I'm sure 3 or 5 years from now, we'll know something else to that. So you just keep answering the question and keep going, further and further. And back in to answer the question, was it, are the stakes higher? We know a lot more. And back then, maybe it was the same answer. Well, Dusty Rhodes is red hot. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe that's it.
Right, but you can also write a column or talk about something, in studio or talk about something during a broadcast, and you can have an opinion on that particular subject. And if you're not backing it up with stats, it's just an opinion. And if you're wrong, well, those feel lighter than something that you are backing up with actual numbers and statistics.
But see, I would push back again, so we're writing this long series, kind of a look back on the 2012 election, right? And one of our contentions is that if you read, depends on the periodical, right? But if you read the words in the New York Times, for example, that don't use any numbers, it's unambiguous that Clinton is sure to win the election, even though they never say like 100% around that. So I very much would push back against the idea that like, if you use numbers, you should be more accountable, right? I think it's when you say, oh, well, we said Trump had a chance, right, with some, line in the 5th footnote. I mean, that's BS, basically, because the difference between, if you care about this stuff, then a 1% chance versus a 49% chance are both having a chance, and those are very different things. But look, I guess I worry a little bit, sounding like kind of Holden Caulfield calling people phonies, but I do think there are people who say, we're all reaching mass audiences now, all 4 or 5 of us on stage, right? There are people who say, I want to make a true argument, and then let me worry about how to make that persuasive and accessible to people. And then there are people who say, I want to persuade people however I can, and if that's true, it's probably better than not, right? But you have basically some people who are honest and some people who are not honest, and I think actually not a lot of in between. I could go through and talk about people as writers, as broadcasters, whatever else, right? But are you primarily truth-driven or not? That is kind of a moral issue for me, I guess.
You know what? I love being wrong. I hate to say that, but I do. I greatly prefer being wrong on Monday or Tuesday than Sunday night, right? And that's part of what this team of people that I have around me, I think 80% of the time they'll send me data and notes and thoughts, and 80% of the time I kind of go, yeah, okay, that, I knew that. But that 20% is where I spend all my time, because that 20% is now telling me there's something else to learn out there. And there are people that have never worn a helmet, and there are people that have never played a down, and have never coached a down, that are teaching me the game of football. And I find that mind-boggling. I have been either a broadcaster or a player since I was about 8 years old. Nobody could be more engaged in the game of football than I have been for the last 58 years. I just don't believe that's possible. Maybe Bill Belichick. He's a little as crazy as I am. But you know, here is the ability of a whole new generation of people, and I've met them. I've sat in front of them, and they're 20% of the time able to tell me that you're a nut. You don't know what you're talking about, and here's why. And I go, son of a gun, I never thought of that before. You know, and that's exciting to me. That's not a bad thing. That's a really good thing.
Well, it comes down to when you're watching a game, we had this conversation just before we came out here, there's a hidden game happening that we just as human beings can't see. I'll frequently watch a game, see a playoff game, and I'll have thoughts while I'm doing it, and I'm studying it, but then afterwards start to go over, when did he bunt? When did he bring this guy in? Oh my God, that's a bad call. Okay, but now take yourself back. Be fair about it, but frequently, again, you know, we're animals. We're attracted to these bright, shiny objects, these sexy things that happen on the field. But what are the less sexy things? You know, the walk in the 5th inning with 1 out. He eventually moved over to second on a ground ball, got to third, scored on a sac fly. Not sexy, not exciting. That was the game-winning run. And the guy does that continually through a 6-month period. Well, that's a winning ball player. So there are smaller hidden things happening all the time that we just cannot capture while it's happening, while you're actually calling a game. You're the first draft of history, and it's going to be the most wrong of all. There's no way to get around that.
These are good segues to one of the questions from the audience. So this is for Chris. How has your pregame interview process changed as teams are increasingly data-driven?
I used to, my whole life, get so frustrated because there was no way I could have known what that player or that coach knew about that team. Now I am constantly stunned with my 300-person scouting department that I am teaching them stuff about their football team. And I'm asking them questions about something, and they go, how did you know that? And part of me wants to say, you know, by 300 guys, and then I say, hey, I'm a journalist. I do this kind of research. You know, I'm not giving away all the credit here. But, you know, it is broadened the ability to take the discussion. Like our guys now have gotten to the point where we can do live grading in games. So truly, I can tell you now that we know more about how Nick Saban's offensive line played in his post-game press conference than he does. What does every coach say? Hey, let me watch the film. I'll get back to you on Tuesday or whatever it is. Not anymore. Not anymore. Because we are now evaluating that while the game is being played, and no matter who you are standing on the sideline, you truly have no idea how that offensive line played. I don't care who you are. And so the dynamic changes, and you can either fight it and be mad, and that's not the way we did it back in the day, or you can embrace it and say, this is better. This is more fun. This is more to talk about. And I think that's where we are now as sports fans.
Brian, this is from the audience also. It's for you. It's how does data fit into the storytelling of boxing? Aside from CompuBox, this could be improved.
Wow, that's a big one. That's one where I'm kind of a Luddite in, having seen so many fights where, and this has changed drastically over the last few years. When I used to call fights, and I've called fights sporadically, I was mostly doing studio work for Friday Night Fights, but I would jump out in the field now and then to fill in and do fights with Teddy Atlas. And at a certain point, I realized the CompuBox computers showed up, and it's sitting there, and more play-by-play, blow-by-blow guys will start going to the fight stats. To me, with fight stats, there's a real problem with the data collection. Two guys with world-class hand speed clash, and they back up. What just happened? You don't know. They don't know. You know, we'll go back and watch Shane Mosley, Oscar De La Hoya, the first fight. You have no idea, let alone guys of smaller weights that are throwing their hands. They don't even know what landed, what threw, what happened. And there's a guy there going like this. Now, and at the end, they'll come out and say, well, Manny Pacquiao outlanded this guy by X amount. And then I'll go back on the tape and I'll go, let me go slow-mo and see who landed and who didn't. Let alone how much force did it really land with, we don't know. And frequently, it'll not only be wrong, but completely wrong or spectacularly wrong. And I go the complete opposite in boxing. When I'm calling a fight, I'm going to use my eyes. And that sounds, like the exact opposite of what I say in baseball and what I just said in baseball. Don't trust your eyes. In boxing, I'd rather trust my eyes because there's so many things that are happening. You'll be able to smell it better than you'll be able to see it with the data. Now, the punch stats can be indicative of an awful lot. I want to know the work rate of a fighter. If I was working with a professional fighter, I'd want to know that, hey, you used to throw 100 punches around, you're down to 80. Hey, you used to throw X amount of jabs in your repertoire. How come you're not throwing them now? But things will change, and there's context with all of that. But my basic point in boxing is just really watch the fight, study the fight, and don't get caught up in the punch stats.
I think we have time for probably one more question. Where was I going to go here? Okay. Nate, you touched on this a little bit, but it's an interesting follow-up. For instances where less probable outcomes happen, how do you respond to critics who take probability to be certainty?
I mean, it's difficult. I think sports fans have a better intuitive grasp of that than people in politics, because in sports fans, we see the long run a lot sooner, right? And so, but to me, people learn if you keep emphasizing probability, they get smarter about it, but you have to be consistent in how you describe it, right? If you have a 70-30 probability, then the articles you write around that, the way you speak about that, has to reflect that, and you have to distinguish that from a 98-2 probability. By the way, there also are cases where, the models that had New England with a 0.1% chance of winning were probably wrong. And they're probably wrong because they didn't account enough for Tom Brady, which is a pretty simple thing, right? But, and the guys who design those models will say, yeah, they're approximations. So, not losing sight of that, like with the CompuBox stuff, for example. Data isn't virginal, and to know how's this data collected, what are the limitations, because where you don't want to get caught out doing is defending the funny part of the model that it isn't doing a good job with. And oftentimes, right, if you went to the mat defending, existentially, the Patriots really only had a 0.1% chance of winning there, I mean, that's not the right battle to fight. The model usually gets you 80% of the way to the truth, but there's 20% that it misses. And as a writer, as an analyst, as an editor, understanding when that 20% is pertinent in a debate you're having, I mean, that's a really critical skill.
Bill, what do you think of that?
I echo Nate. I mean, I wrote a piece on that Patriots game, and I led with they had a 0.2% chance of winning. And to me, I mean, it's not incredibly important to me that it might be 0.1%, it might be 0.5%. I mean, clearly it wasn't 30%, it wasn't significantly off, but there's definitely a hyper specificity there that is probably unwarranted. But I think it's more about, it's more about the story you're telling, right? I'm not saying, oh, well, you should have bet on the Patriots at those exact odds. That's crazy. But it's more, they went from very small number to 100%. And they went along the way and stuff happened. And I think, what made that story good, hopefully, was it was about, okay, well, it actually wasn't about really those plays in the middle. All the plays, you remember the Edelman catch, those plays were awesome, but they didn't really make that much difference. It was really about them hitting the two-pointers and and getting that turnover. Otherwise, they probably don't win. So, I think it's really the story you tell more so than the specific number down to the decimal point.
Well, I'd almost throw in, made me think of win probability is a big thing, and we get down to the World Series, right? And the Cubs and the Indians, and the Cubs win probability when Joe Madden brought in Aroldis Chapman in Game 6 was 97%. Which tells you, okay, in no way, shape, or form should you bring in Aroldis Chapman in Game 6 with a 5-run lead with 2 outs in the 8th inning. Yeah. But that's not all of it. It's 97% win probability, but what you also have a 3% chance of losing, and what are you risking? You're risking the end of the season. So that's a big loss that you need to avoid at almost all costs. So I don't think it's it's not a simple equation. And there's a great probability study where, 97% chance of winning. But what if you lost and your season is over? It's not taking everything into account. You need to look at the whole scope of what is also at stake.
I feel like we've looked at the whole scope of what this panel can be. That's all we got. Thank you, everybody.